Thank you for inviting me to join you today. I'm Peter Scott, the President and CEO of the Commonwealth of Learning, COL, talking to you the 8th International Conference on Research and Practices in Education in Pakistan. I'm speaking to you from British Columbia, here in Canada. Today I'll be talking to you about open equity and the power of small things to make big changes. The Commonwealth of Learning believes that openness is a truly powerful force to finally reach out to the large pools of chronic inequity in lack of access to quality education for so many in our world. I describe this challenge as chronic, not because the solutions are not there, but that the solutions that we have chosen to historically apply, the instruments of conventional, formal education, currently serve to replicate rather than to overcome this challenge. Our business as usual in learning must change. Fortunately, new instruments are increasingly viable and more readily available. There's a number of things we can do to disrupt and then change that business as usual. AI, for example, is a major disruptor of our future, and indeed our right now. In this talk I won't speak to AI, but instead look at things that are small and powerful, micro-credentials. But it's important to note that my second point, since I mentioned AI and technology as a disruptor, from our perspective here in the Commonwealth of Learning, it is critical to recognize that humans have to be critically involved in any learning loop that we create. Learning isn't about technology, it's about us and the transformation of us and the relationships we have, we make, and we change. Learning must focus on the learner, and not the technology, not the institution. The tools we create can sustain or can disrupt, and it's really important to know when to do either of those things. Finally, I'll be tapping into the critical change that we can make today, which a recognition of our increasingly digital world demands. Digitalization, networks, connectivity, and smart devices helps us to create together powerful things that change our old cost equations about what we can now easily make sense of and easily do. When you add open to digitalization, there is a strong promise to increase equity, drive down cost, and improve quality. I'll talk about COL's current push to help our world to use some new small things to genuinely start to change. But a little about me first. I am a lifelong educator, having spent my entire career in universities until very recently. I started teaching in the United Kingdom, working at the Open University and the University of Sheffield. Then I moved to Australia to be Pro-Vice-Chancellor of Education at the University of Technology in Sydney. And then I was the president of Athabasca University, Canada's Open University. And now I have moved out of education into a world of policy and governance for development. I'm the president and CAO of an intergovernmental organization representing the 56 nations of the Commonwealth. So, a little bit about COL before we dive in. The Commonwealth of Learning works for the Commonwealth of Nations. That's around 2.5 billion people across the world in 56 countries. We are headquartered in Vancouver in India and have a team, Vancouver in Canada, and have a team in India. And we're bound by a memorandum of understanding with our 56 nations that was signed in 1988 to drive learning innovation, particularly leveraging open education. An interesting feature of our community of nations is that many share traditions and practices that come from a common root, so they're potentially a bit more easy to integrate anyway. And we host the majority of the world's small states, so for many of our countries, it's in theory much easier to find the right person to agree to get something done. And also to provide those smaller countries with a bigger voice on the global stage. Whatever we do, it is to make nations stronger together and their national institutions equally stronger together, and their learning communities better served. We're probably best known for the media we create. Cole produces, in collaboration with our country partners, an awful lot of courses, typically small ones, typically short and typically highly focused, all targeted to an individual need and a specific country requirement. Seen here, for example, are a few short forms of learning related to youth in the Pacific. In everything we do, it is done together as a partnership. It is designed from scratch to be shared amongst those partners. When we work in the Pacific to do something, it's intended to be just as useful when tuned to the needs of the Caribbean or Africa or wherever. What we've done over the last 37 years is to build capacity in low-capacity contexts where conventional education hasn't worked and isn't working, isn't affordable, isn't equitable. Increasingly, in our world, that's kind of everywhere. Despite huge continuing investments, no country has wiped out educational inequity. So we work to enfranchise the disadvantaged learners of our planet. But it isn't the content or the courses that most matter to us, it's actually policy. The way you get to scale in innovation is by having governments lead on it, to regulate and encourage their learning systems to get to those disenfranchised learners. Where you can create a policy that's actually used, and then where you can drive it towards open, that promises scale and significant change. Now, education is a highly structured process at every level of learner engagement. The institutes that governments regulate manage pathways that we call curriculum. Curriculum is measured, and by and large, through assessments that give credit, it is the credit that makes the measurement of progress towards your skill or competence. At the minute, all of those things are locked into large, inflexible, institution and teacher-centric pathways. We measure curriculum as credit, and the cost of running our systems is essentially the cost of the credits that we worked with the learners on. Whatever level that is, really, whether it is implicit or explicit, it's credit that is the currency of learning. Credit creates credentials of various sorts and marks the learner's success. Unfortunately, credit is hard to exchange, and it does not flow freely in any of our current systems. Indeed, I'd say it's often created with the opposite intention, kind of designed to be locked in to how an institution thinks about what a learner's experience should be. And that is pretty inflexible. But over recent years, institutions have been driven to think about the process of freeing credit, to allow it to move with its learners, even creating ways to exchange credit amongst institutions. There's typically an acronym for that with words like prior learning recognition in it. But it is fair to say the process has not been a fast process or a flexible process. In many institutions, getting credit to move between departments in an institution is hard, never mind between different and competing institutions themselves. And as for crossing state borders, well, that's often very much harder. More and more institutions and countries have become interested in the idea of those smaller opportunities to make credit move and change in a more micro way. Small things that could make the movement of credit and the extent of credit transfer much easier. Historically, we have looked at this over the years. Our latest report was about 5 years ago. And we looked at how countries are now starting to measure credit in simpler ways and perhaps allowing them to move across borders and transfer between communities. Our report in 2019 here looked at countries like Malawi, Namibia and Zambia as case studies where this was starting to happen, and even into regions like the Caribbean and Southern Africa, where 5 years ago we could see governments starting to regulate how credit could, in theory, flow across their regions. So bringing that bang up to date, our work this year has now noted a lot more of a global attempt to look at how different countries in areas that have now become very sophisticated do understand how credit could be regulated on a higher level, and how that learning experience, which is quality assured, could be supported by common regulation to make that credit exchange more doable. All of that helps us to reach into how credit could flow to where there is inequity and where access is not available. So strikingly, countries like Australia and New Zealand have a very strong qualifications framework, which works right the way down. And now some of those can include short forms of learning, which is micro-credentials and short courses, within the regulatory frameworks themselves. The definition of those small things has become much more reliable as well. So for example, in UNESCO 2022, we see a very good definition of what it means to be a small credential. UNESCO's definition talks about a record of focused learning achievement, verifying what the learner knows, including through assessment. You have to be able to verify that the learning is there and that that skill, the competence, is owned by that learner, and that that's connected to definitions of a trusted provider, generally a national institution. A micro must have a standalone value and contribute and complement other things, which can be either smaller credentials or even macro credentials, and has to be accounted for through prior learning credit. It also has to meet the standards of relevant quality assurance bodies, some authorizing agency. Cole would add but a few things to that simple definition. For us, we also recognize the idea that learning can be badged and trackable. It needs to have a recognized, verifiable tie between the individual and verifier. And now it can actually be provided by even non-academic providers, including employers themselves. And it can be shared using social media techniques and other technologies. Most importantly, as very short forms of learning, the focus on authentication of assessment is very important. An assessment verifies that the learner has the skill or competence, and a badge will show that. For example, here, I've done some work in the University of Technology in Sydney. Here are some of their badges, but more and more, it should be possible to bring in small credentials and such things from even non-institutional providers, universities, non-providers and other institutions, into a much richer mix to allow learners to more flexibly change and augment their learning pathway, or just simply demonstrate one important skill. For our purposes, it's not just good for learners directly, but it's also a kind of structured disruptive force inside institutional thinking to allow us to reach out beyond the boundaries of that institution. If credit can flow from one institution to another and count towards even different types of qualifications, and that's managed by the learner themselves, if it's clearly defined with respect to the learning outcomes and the skills associated with it, then it should become part of a broader view of what learning even is. But that clearly raises a whole bunch of issues that have yet to be resolved, and that's what Cole is currently working on. We're currently looking at the nature of the framework, how you could scale it, how it could be transferred to resources that would support it, etc., etc. The work we're currently engaged in is an ongoing project with selected governments, and our intent is to go through a consultation phase and a series of meetings through this year. We'll report our initial findings at our conference in September and set the new program of work from there. We aim to look at how we could nationally implement that in a selected range of countries through 26, and then scale with institutional partners in 2027. As we look to the areas in which we work, all the way from universities through skills-based providers in TVET and down through to schools, we can see the need for a much more flexible education working system by each of those areas. We can start to see how more open and more flexible use of credit could be significantly powerful to change all of those systems. You kind of have to start at the university level because the impact of tertiary education flows all the way through the skills sector and out into schooling. For school learners, bridging that gap to groups of excluded learners starts with the disaggregation and a rethinking of how we run curriculum, even to what constitutes critical skills for employers, for those individuals as they grow, and how that can be pulled together in more creative, learner-centered ways. Coming to the vocational landscape, using technology to think differently about empowering youth is a significant opportunity to grasp right now. We've been working on the skills framework for TVET through small things for very many years. And I'm delighted now to invite you to our Pan-Commonwealth Forum conference, which will be running in Botswana, Africa, this September. We'll be talking about this framework and the small things change agenda in much more detail. Thank you very much for allowing me to sketch out quickly where we are today. And what I leave you here is with a message we provided to the 56 heads of government of the Commonwealth in Samoa last year. Learning innovation is critically needed now to reach to that chronic systemic disadvantage. Conventional education has failed to do that and will continue to fail to do that. But open education, together with technology innovation, has the opportunity to make that change and make it now. Finally, we hope to bring a large number of international voices together around a common learning policy to sustainably change our planet and the lives of our learners. Thank you very much.